Hello, I'm Sean the Lore Hunter, and in this video I'm discussing my thoughts about and experience with the Mortal Shell beta. Up front, I will say that I came into the beta a bit skeptical. The game looked cool, but the trailers were all very self-serious in a way that I wasn't sure was appealing, and the gameplay footage from the IGN Summer of Games didn't sell me on the combat. But after playing through the beta a few times, I'm pretty sold. Even more than sold, I'm really excited for the full release. I am mostly sold on the big ideas the beta presents, but what really pulled me in were the myriad of small touches that ended up making a big difference. So I guess if you're curious if I liked the beta or not, you can jet now, like and subscribe, but otherwise, let's get into it. First, I'll quickly cover the basics of Mortal Shell from what was in the demo. Mortal Shell is not coy about its influences, and developer Cold Symmetry officially describes it as an action RPG built upon the ruthless traditions of the Souls-like genre. In the demo, this can be seen in the methodical, stamina-based combat, the technically beatable tutorial boss that most players will likely die to, the challenging enemy encounters, and a loading screen that is actionably similar to the loading screen in Dark Souls. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the term Souls-like. Dark Souls is an action RPG that succeeds in being more than the sum of its parts, with different parts being more or less important to different people. So creating a subgenre which breaks down the constituent parts and then applies the term to any game that was inspired to borrow a few elements inherently will not resonate with people who don't value the borrowed pieces as highly, and won't feel Souls-like to them. That being said, the Mortal Shell beta worked for me in ways that did resonate with what I value most highly about Dark Souls, chiefly tone and attention to detail. I feel confident saying that if the beta is a microcosm of the full release, Mortal Shell may be one of, if not the most successful titles bearing the mantle of Souls-like. In the beta, you play through a short tutorial section and then a vertical slice of two different areas, Fulgrim Outskirts and the Crypt of Martyrs, with a boss as the finale, Enslaved Grisha. There were two NPCs in the beta, the skill unlock lady named Sester Ganessa and a merchant named Vlas. You have access to two of the four shells that will be in the full game, Harros and Teal, and access to two of the four weapons, the Hallowed Sword and the Hammer and Chisel. You inhabit one shell at a time, but you can swap back and forth in the hub as you see fit. Each shell has differing health, stamina, and resolve, as well as individual skill trees that unlock unique abilities. Each weapon has a unique moveset and special moves that can be performed by spending resolve. Instead of leveling up your character, you unlock skills for your shells and upgrade your weapons. You do this by spending tar and glimpses, which are accrued by killing enemies and consuming items. Tar is essentially souls from Dark Souls, functioning as both experience and currency, and will stay tied to the statue that remains when you last died, which, like a bloodstain in Dark Souls, will disappear along with your tar if you die again before getting back to it. Glimpses stay tied to the shell being used when they were accrued, but are not lost upon death. Items, of which there were many in the beta, have a familiarity mechanic. If you've never used an item, the effects of using it are unknown. Once you use it, the effect is revealed. Use a type of item repeatedly and the familiarity increases, which can alter the effects of the item and provide more lore in the description. I mentioned the methodical, stamina-based combat previously. You can perform light attacks, heavy attacks, and leaping attacks. You can sprint, dash, and roll. You use an item called the Tarnished Seal to parry, and can spend resolve to do a riposte that restores health. Attacks, jumps, and dodges can be combined together in many different ways. For an in-depth look at the attack combos, check out the video at the top right by Boomstick Gaming. Last, but certainly not least, you can harden. Hardening turns your character to stone, making them invulnerable to the next hit. Hardening can be done indefinitely if you're not hit, and can be done mid-attack or jump animation, essentially freezing your character in place but maintaining momentum. That means you can start an attack, harden, take a hit, and then perform a quick counter in the form of finishing the attack animation. And that about covers the basics of the beta, except for one thing. There is a cat, and you can pet it as many times as you'd like. I tested it, and you can give that cat scritchy scratchies as long as you'd like. The Mortal Shell beta mostly sold me on the big ideas. The slow, methodical combat was a welcome respite from the fast-paced intensity of other action games and action RPGs. It reminded me of the commitment and intentionality of the combat in Dark Souls 1 and 2. One concern I had going into the beta was feedback from the attacks, both the players and the enemies. The beta assuaged most of that concern, but there were times when I'd only notice I'd taken damage by my health bar going down, or it would seem like the enemy did not react to being struck. In a live stream with Fextra Life, Mortal Shell producer Kieran Ramdawar stated that this was something being addressed by the team, and that they'd begun to tweak in response to feedback from the gameplay footage shown at IGN's Summer of Gaming. So it improved from the showcase into the beta, and could further improve in the full release. I did not find it to be something that tarnished my time in the beta, and hearing the devs respond so swiftly to feedback is very heartening, and builds a lot of goodwill towards cold symmetry for me. The hardening mechanic, which is perhaps the most novel addition to the Souls-like formula, worked really well for me. It is a simple idea that has tons of depth and implications for the combat, and my 10 hours with the beta have me feeling like I've only scratched the surface of this mechanic. Figuring out when to harden to avoid damage and dole out maximum damage is a delight, and managing the cooldown on hardening and using it in conjunction with other defensive mechanics like dash and parry make for a surprisingly deep combat system that I'm eager to get more time with. I also really liked that when you dashed or dodged, your character would momentarily appear stone-like as when they harden. It's a nice attention to detail that provides consistency to the visual language of the game, and helps to further signal to the player when they're invulnerable to damage. I was not very good at parrying, but tying the parry to a health regain system was very interesting and satisfying when I did pull it off. Your tarnished shield glows before attacks where you cannot parry, which was a nice touch. The item description describes that the etchings pulse when blood slicks its face, which led me to imagine that the seal senses your character's quickening pulse as a deadly attack comes their way and anticipates the bloodshed should you choose to try and parry. Ultimately, parrying in the demo experience for me was underutilized, even with the health regain. For one, if I had no resolve, a successful parry would only give me one resolve, meaning I'd need to do another parry to regain health. And secondly, if I needed health, the risk of parrying felt too great, and I chose a more defensive path forward. The two shells in the beta, Harros and Teal, felt meaningfully different. Harros is the balanced shell, with their health, stamina, and resolve stats equal across the board and skills focusing on hardening. Teal is the quick shell, with low health and resolve, but massive stamina and a special shadow dodge. The issue I ran into is that I had a hard time playing Harros over Teal. Teal's frankly ridiculous stamina and shadow dodge gave me much more flexibility in combat. Combined with the chisel and hammer, Teal could easily stun-lock later enemies before they could strike, and could get in hits and duck out against tougher enemies. Conversely, Harros sports more health and 4 resolve instead of 2. I rarely found myself in a position where I needed more than 2 resolve, and the marginally larger health pool seemed inadequate compared to much more stamina and a better dodge. That being said, I think Teal fell more comfortably into a playstyle I'm more accustomed to. Harros may shine more with a more solid grasp on hardening, and utilizing the resolve system to perform more special attacks and empowered ripostes. But, at least in the beta, my experience was that Teal was the superior shell. The shells did feel meaningfully different though, and I'm excited to see what other shells and weapons offer in the full release. I also did a no-shell run of the beta. It was really hard, but very cool. You can harden but not parry, at least in the demo. You can still use weapons as normal. The big differences are that you have 1 HP and infinite stamina, so you are very mobile but cannot take any damage. I'm not sure if I'm good enough to make it through the full game with no shell, and Slave Grisha took me a solid couple hours to beat as it was. But it was a really wild way to play, and I look forward to seeing no shell challenge runs of the full release. Even while I did not feel the shells were equally powerful in my hands, I like the concept of playing with these defined presets where I'm not able to boost the health and stamina to the soft cap like I do in most Souls games. These restrictions forced me to consider how I was engaging in the situations beyond the weapon I was using. Working with the limitations of the shells and leaning into the playstyle suggested by their stats and skills was fun, and I look forward to seeing what the other two shells, Airdrum and Solomon, bring to the table. One thing I did not expect to leave the beta excited about were items. I think the familiarity system is really cool. On a first playthrough, it was exciting to get an item, not knowing what it does. Poisoning myself with the tar spore item felt like a trap, one that I thought was pretty funny. But then I discovered that familiarizing myself with the tar spore item meant that the next time I popped one, it would instead make my character immune to poison for 2 minutes, and that was awesome. Other items get better at what they do as you get more familiar, and some gain unexpected bonuses. The item progression feels meaningful and makes consumables interesting and appealing to play with. What you can do with the items was also robust, with some being simple healing items that you would pick up and others gaining a special benefit to the next harden or parry that you performed. This latter class of item became an interesting consideration in encounters, especially boss encounters, where it would stack a few items for actions I was going to use and give me an edge in the fight. I really like this kind of tactical decision making. This combined with familiarity made items a much more interesting system than I usually find in games. The level design in the beta was adequate but not particularly special. There were different routes to take through the areas, so choosing which order to explore was fun, but the areas were pretty linear overall without any particularly striking geometry or vistas. Speaking of visuals, the color palette in the beta was a bit muted, and overall the game just felt a little dark when tuned correctly in a way that reduced the contrast and muddied things a bit for me. There were a few secrets baked into the level design, like this hidden pathway, and I spent a good 10 minutes struggling to get the shiny on the hill and learn the arcane recipe for Brother Faustin's special soup. Yummy. I also discovered that striking the wall in certain spots revealed some lore notes, which of course prompted me to go around the entire beta smacking the walls. The encounter design was competent and engaging, but also nothing that really stood out to me. The progression of encounters followed the tried and true formula of introducing an enemy and then increasing the number and mixing them in with different enemies in more challenging configurations. The boss enslaved Grisha, who is a mini-boss in the full release, had a relatively limited moveset, but I found it satisfying to figure out how to best counter his attacks with each weapon and shell. You can supposedly parry Grisha, but my few attempts did not go well to say the least. But I love that you're able to use your full bag of tricks against the boss. So while the big ideas in the demo generally worked for me, if a bit rough around the edges in some parts, the thing that really endeared me to Mortal Shell from the beta were the wealth of small touches and decisions that added character to the world. For instance, my initial impression of the world from the trailers as being perhaps too self-serious was proven wrong by some funny moments in the beta. The Merchant Vlas is just a funny and well-animated character with entertaining dialogue, and Sester Ganessa had perhaps my favorite line in the beta.
Not so hasty. Not all places are as friendly as Fulgrim. There won't...
When a piece of media is very dark, you need those moments of levity to build contrast and give the world a bit more character and shape. In a similar vein, the enemy and boss designs were kinda derpy, and I mean that in the best way possible. Like these spear guys in Fulgrim, they can wreck you and instill panic in me when they connect, yet they also have these dorky masks on. And these sword guys in the Crypt of Martyrs, who get so mad at you they literally throw their head at you. While varying in the flavor of absurdity they present, the enemy designs felt very much at home amongst Castlevania and Dark Souls enemies, and the absurd/terrifying duality contributed to the dark fantasy atmosphere and tone. Speaking of tone, playing the loot is just a good time. While it is a little funny that you can spam the loot to maximize familiarity in under a minute, it works with the familiarity system in a cool way. The more you play the loot, the better the song that is played sounds. Like the cat you can pet, the loot doesn't seem to serve any real purpose, but signals to me that the developer is passionate about the world they're building, and these small fun moments worked for me. The act of upgrading your shell skills was also very satisfying. Upgrading a skill with Sester Ganessa makes this cracking sound as you hold the prompt, which was a nice and thematic touch. The shell would then relate a bit more of their past. The voice acting was good, and I found myself interested in their history and what new narrative the skills would bring. This final thought isn't so much a small detail as good attention to detail and a narrative mechanic that I think adds good replay value and motivates players to try out different shells for story reasons. NPCs have unique dialogue depending on what shell you're inhabiting, including unique dialogue if you're sporting no shell. This further characterizes both the NPCs and the shells, and we learn more about the world through these unique interactions. I can already tell that visiting NPCs with each shell is something I'll be doing a lot of in the full release.
Just come closer.
And those are my thoughts and impressions on the Mortal Shell beta. The beta showed off a lot of cool and novel ideas, and the areas where it fell short were not foundational to the play and could be iterated or improved upon. I think it is telling that the beta has gotten me very excited for the full release. And at $30, it seems like it will provide a fun, modest experience that easily lends itself to diving into the deep end with challenge runs and trying out other shells and weapons. Following this video will be the start of my Mortal Shell So Far series. Where this was very subjective, Mortal Shell So Far covers in more depth and detail the information we know about the game and the development in a very complete and condensed package. So subscribe to the channel and ding the bell to be alerted when those videos come out. I'm also starting to push my Patreon more, and to that end I will be posting up some additional Mortal Shell beta gameplay footage for patrons. So if that sounds interesting, click the link in the description. Thanks for watching.